Discover the amazing, clinically proven health benefits of original Tahitian noni. Original Tahitian noni includes powerful antioxidants, adaptogens, nutrients, and phytonutrients to naturally boost energy levels, immune system function, and overall health. Meticulously sourced from French Polynesia, this is the original superfruit. Accept no imitations. Original Tahitian noni. Visit ATR Health at alchemicaltechrevolution.com. and click on the Shop Here tab for more details.
But we can no longer risk emergency improvisation of national defense. We have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry of vast proportions. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
You're listening to the Alchemical Tech Revolution, and I am your host, Wayne McRoy. Good evening, good morning, wherever you are around the world tonight. We're going to discuss Rosicrucianism's 7 planes of existence. Tonight we're going to talk about what the Rosicrucians believe is the nature of consciousness and how it exists in these 7 planes of existence. It's an interesting concept we'll be looking at here tonight, for certain. This gives you a little bit of insight into the cosmology of the Rosicrucian Brotherhood, as well as the other occult fraternities and secret society groups, what they believe to be the nature of how things really operate in this world. Much of this kept hidden from the masses for a very long time in what they term their secret doctrine. Now, the Rosicrucians have their own secret doctrine, as do the other schools of thought. But all of this secret doctrine of all these various schools, it all describes the same exact things, just sometimes in slightly different terms. They use different words to describe the same things. Sometimes they have slight nuances and differences in how they accept these things to be, but they're all describing the same things, essentially. And all of these are said to come from some much older teachings. Now, I like to look at the Rosicrucian writings because it gives you a very concise picture of what it is that they believe in these other occult fraternities. It gives you a pretty good blueprint for understanding what is being conveyed here. And they do so in some pretty plain language in certain of these writings. So tonight we're going to be reading from a book titled The Secret Doctrine of the Rosicrucians, written by one Magus Incognito. So this was somebody who wrote this who had a very good understanding and grasp of the occult concepts within Rosicrucianism and didn't want to actually put his name out there. So it's an anonymous source, essentially, but I could attest the things that are said here are supported by other writings from within the group. So the things being said here seem to be a pretty accurate interpretation of what it is the Rosicrucians believe, even though this author decided to remain anonymous. What were the reasons for this, I can't claim to know. I know oftentimes they take some pretty heavy-duty blood oaths to keep the secrets of the fraternity just that, hidden from the profane, that's you and I, from the outside world. And sometimes when you write something and try to describe these things plainly, they take exception to that because they don't want this material to get outside of their brotherhood. So that being the case, maybe that's why he went through the trouble of disguising who he was, or submitting this work anonymously, or perhaps he has some other altruistic reason for doing so. I don't know. I don't know what the author's intention was here. So I don't claim to know, and I don't pretend to know why he would put this stuff forward. But what I do know is just because the source remains anonymous doesn't mean we need to discredit or discount the material presented. Because like I said, it does align very heavily with many other Rosicrucian writings. You see, it seems to be a compilation of work in this book given here to give somebody with very little exposure to these ideas a basis to work from with it. It describes the things in pretty plain language for those of us who haven't been exposed to this type of research. So it makes it a little easier to digest. And that's why I like to find sources like this. And of course, you do have to do the due diligence and go back and compare it to other writings. And I've done so, and I find that this aligns with those other writings. That's why I'm presenting it here. So tonight, the nature of consciousness and how it relates to these 7 different planes of existence according to Rosicrucian doctrine. The term consciousness is one most difficult to define adequately, and this quite naturally, for consciousness can be defined and described only in the terms of its own experiences. There is no other term analogous to it which would serve to indicate to one who'd not experienced consciousness. The word which probably best expresses the general idea is the term awareness. The Rosicrucian teachings hold that consciousness manifests on 7 planes, each of which planes is interlinked with and blends into the one on the other side of it. But each plane is composed of 7 subplanes, and each subplane of 7 minor planes, and so on until the multiplication is made 7 times. Each of the 7 planes of consciousness is named in the following synopsis of teaching, and the main characteristics of each plane is given. And I'm going to pause for a moment here, folks. So, what they teach within this secret doctrine is we have these 7 planes of existence, and on each of these 7 planes there are 7 subplanes, and on each of those subplanes, 7 subplanes, on down the line 7 times. You can work out the math all you would like. So this gives you a broad picture of what it is that they express, and some of these ideas get super complicated at points. When you're breaking down terms of 7 to the 7th power of a number of planes and subplanes, it gets to be quite convoluted at some point. But what they do is they try to give you a basic description of what each of these planes is, and they'll describe some of the subplanes because they correspond to other subplanes in other of the 7 planes, according to the Hermetic axiom, as above, so below. So only in describing these 7 planes, they can give you an adequate description of all the subplanes and sub-subplanes, etc., etc. Like I said, I know it sounds confusing and convoluted, but you could apply the same set of standards to all of these different subplanes. This is what they teach. And this aligns with Hermetic philosophy as well, as we see. But let's get into it here. The first plane is the plane of the elements. On this plane of consciousness is manifested the actions and reactions between the subtle elements of which all material forms are composed. Here occurs the play between the atoms, the electrons, the ions, the corpuscles, and the still more tenuous particles of substance, of which science has as yet no knowledge. And going still further back, it may be said that on this plane occurs the play of phases of substance as much more tenuous and subtle than the electrons, as the latter are more tenuous than the atoms. Little can be said concerning these practically unknown forms and phases of matter, although the occult teachings are quite full of them. Going to pause for a moment here, folks. So now you know where the cult of quantum comes from. It is a direct misinterpretation of the old occult sciences here. It's an inversion. You see, they want to have a fundamental particle for everything. And I don't think that this is an adequate description of how things truly work. But of course, it's all about the quantification of a thing in order to make it measurable and controllable in some regard. So they've misapplied the old occult axioms and sciences to this to invert the process, and they've turned the old alchemical or occult sciences into what we would, in the modern terms, call cybernetics. It's a cybernetics application here. It's about controlling whole systems. Essentially, that's why they seek to quantify everything in this way and try to equate everything down to a fundamental particle. Now, many of these ideas have their roots in the old occult sciences, but they've been misinterpreted and misrepresented in the modern era, in our modern science, or more properly, scientism. But let's continue on. In previous quotations from Haeckel and other modern scientists, we have seen that advanced modern science recognizes the presence of something like consciousness in the atoms of matter and ascribes their movements to likes and dislikes, loves and hates, arising from the perception of certain qualities in each other and the response thereto. This means, of course, that the atoms possess and manifest feeling and will in an elementary form, phase, and degree. There are results arising from these manifestations of consciousness on the part of the atoms, however, which are not usually taken notice of by writers of the subject, either in the ranks of the occultists or those of science. Let us now consider these briefly. So I'm going to pause for a moment here. So now, the Rosicrucians acknowledge what modern science does not. The natural world, our creation, has a natural form of intelligence guiding and directing it. It's an inherent intelligence. There's intelligent design. You see, that's what they try to separate out from this, is this notion of intelligent design. This idea or notion that there is a creator, that there is intelligent design. They want you to believe in modern science everything came about by accident. It's a happy accident that we're here. Well, nothing could be further from the truth. We see the intelligence inherent in the natural world, don't we? And this is something that's not lost on the occultists. They've recognized this for a long time, but part of this inversion process and this re-establishing the occult sciences in the name of cybernetics brings in this inversion principle. So they don't want you to believe there's an absolute creator or intelligence guiding things. That's why they present it in modern science in the way they do. But let's go ahead and get back to the reading here. Science informs us that all forms of physical energy or force, manifesting as light, heat, electricity, magnetism, etc., arise from the vibrations of the particles of which matter is composed. These vibrations are, of course, caused by the motion of the particles, and these motions are caused by the manifestation of attraction or repulsion between the particles. Proceeding further, we see that the manifestation of attraction and repulsion between the particles of matter arise from the likes and dislikes, the loves and hates of the atoms and particles, and that these, in turn, are but manifestations of elemental consciousness. So we see here that even the manifestation of physical energy and force is but the accompaniment and result of the presence and activity of elemental consciousness. And I'm going to pause for a moment here, folks. I think this is one of the key important facets to this that needs to be considered. You see, they do try in our modern science to equate everything to a fundamental particle and its motions. Well, what causes the motions? This is what they have a very poor understanding of. Now, they have identified several different forces, which they claim are what cause the motion of the particles. But they don't adequately understand what those forces are, either. So they describe those as things like magnetism, the strong force and the weak force in the nuclear physics of it, and things of this nature, and gravitation, but they don't understand what is the causative factor of these forces. Why do we have this inherent polarity in everything that causes the motion in these, for lack of a better term, fundamental particles? This vibration, this frequency, what causes the frequency and vibration? Well, it's these differences that manifest inside these fundamental particles. And of course, they've made an attempt to describe these in a non-intelligent way in our modern science as these forces, but they still have very little concept of what is the actual causative factor to these forces. Well, the Rosicrucians know, and they claim it's a type of elemental consciousness, and I don't think they're wrong. I think there is some core of truth and value to this. There is a guiding intelligence to these things. Doesn't necessarily equate to something that we can measure in a physical or material world sense here, but we can see the effects of it in the physical material world sense. And that's what we're looking at. It's like trying to describe what is the wind, or look at the wind. How do you see the wind? You don't see the wind, you see the effects of the wind. It's the same kind of thing. So these manifestations, these intelligences from this spiritual plane of elementals cause some of the differentiation within the fundamental particles as described here. And this is wherein it comes from. So it's a type of consciousness. It's an intelligence. Let's read on. On this plane of consciousness are operated many of these main forms of magic known to all occultists. The occultists move matter not by exerting a physical force upon it, but by means of his mind and will, but instead by acting upon the consciousness of the material atoms by the power of his own consciousness. This is no place, of course, to go into detail concerning this phase of occultism, but it has been thought well to indicate here the source and nature of the power underlying occult phenomena of this kind, and the why and wherefore of its manifestation. I'm going to pause for a moment here, folks. So, magicians claim to be able to manipulate matter based upon this principle. Not so much about the use of his mind and will, but instead acting upon the consciousness of these particles by his own consciousness, in a sense. That's what the claim is here. Now, a lot of this does sound very convoluted and confusing, I know, because all of these magicians are all about the application of their will in this regard, and this is contradicting that in many ways. But that's a subject for another time. Let's read on. The plane of elemental consciousness, like all the great planes of consciousness, contains 7 subplanes, and each of these 7 minor planes, and so on, until the multiplication has been made 7 times. The subplane we have just briefly considered is but one of the 7, and the remaining 6 are equally important. In these unmentioned subplanes, there are manifestations utterly unknown to modern science and to the uninformed person, but of which the occult masters have made a careful and thorough study. And I'm going to pause for a moment again here. Now, these claims are always made, but they never tell you what it is that these occult masters claim to know about this. At least I haven't come across anything. They acknowledge we have these other planes. We can't possibly conceive of how they work, but some of our occult masters know. Do they? Well, why haven't they shared this knowledge with other initiates that they deem worthy? They'll tell you this, and they'll claim to know something that you don't, and maybe the author of this claims to understand some of this, but doesn't want to go into detail. But these are just claims. And this is the problem with much of this. They always claim some deeper level of knowledge on a thing without demonstrating that knowledge or giving you any indication of that knowledge. You see, it always seems in these occult fraternities, there's always more secrets to grasp for. Just out of reach, no matter how far along the path you get into these occult fraternities. Well, this is all part of the control system, folks. It's all to keep those people doing the will of the organization. You strive for the secrets, and maybe, just maybe, if you're good enough and you're righteous enough and holy enough and you study enough and you're smart enough and you understand enough, then maybe at some point some of those secrets might be revealed to you by your teacher, but probably not, because you're never quite good enough. That's how this works in all these occult fraternities. So you're always grasping after wind. That's how the book of Ecclesiastes describes it. Grasping after wind. Chasing after wind. You're never going to catch it. And you see where it becomes problematic. It's an exercise in futility, seeking after much of this occult knowledge, because at the end of the day, even if there is something to it, you're never going to fully grasp it in your finite human consciousness, in your finite human understanding. And that is the problem, isn't it? But there are those human beings who claim to know things. Now, do they really know things? I can't say for sure. It would seem to me a lot of it's a manipulation, though. They want you to believe that they know something that you don't. Just even that aspect of things gives them a type of power over you or control over you. And this is largely what's been done with a lot of these occult teachings. You see, it's all about controlling people at the end of the day. But let's continue on here. So next, it goes into number 2, the plane of the minerals. On this plane of consciousness are manifested the actions and reactions of the molecules of which the minerals are composed, and of the masses of mineral matter as well. Just as the atoms of matter manifest attraction and repulsion, arising from the like and dislike of consciousness, so do the molecules of matter manifest a similar like and dislike, resulting in the attraction and repulsion between molecules and masses of matter. The molecules or particles of which a piece of steel, for instance, is composed, hold together by reason of the attractive power of cohesion, and not because they are fastened together by any mechanical means employed by nature. In the same way, gravitation manifests its attractive force. So I'm going to pause for a moment there. So now we see some of these comparisons being made to things that are accepted in the modern scientific paradigm here, trying to explain gravity, the attractive force, all these things that have been described in modern physics as fundamental forces within the particles themselves. The strong attractive force, strong nuclear force, the weak nuclear force, gravitation, electromagnetism. These are your 4 basic forces in the modern paradigm of science that they would like you to believe and grasp hold of. Now, it would seem there may be some value in core truths in that way of thinking, but it's misrepresented as something lifeless. You see, they've taken the life and intelligence out of it by describing it in that way. So at any rate, let's go ahead and we'll continue reading here. Moreover, on some of the higher minor planes of the plane of the minerals, there is manifested the crystallization of mineral particles according to a definite principle of design embedded in the consciousness of its particles. The crystal is built upon a definite plane just as truly as is the acorn or the oak. And in all of these cases, the pattern is but an idea in the consciousness of the combined particles. The universal builder works through the consciousness of the mineral particles just as truly and as wonderfully as through the particles of humanity which we call individual men. The study of crystals and their formation will open up a new world of thought to the average person and will give him a peep into the workshop of the universal builder in which he will see things heretofore unsuspected and undreamt. Going to pause for a moment here. Crystals are a fascinating subject, a fascinating thing to look at and explore the ideas of how they form, because you can see this intelligence, this consciousness inherent in their formation. It is kind of like a blueprint that's used to formulate these things. And so you would have to infer there is some intelligence in the design thereof. They don't just form randomly. So there's even in things that we consider to be unconscious in this world or unintelligent, there's an inherent intelligence guiding and directing that. Minerals, crystals, fascinating stuff. Let's continue on. The common opinion is that crystals are formed by mechanical causes, such as outside pressure, etc., But the careful student of science, as well as the occultist, knows that the formation of a crystal is a growth, and is as much the result of stored up physical or psychical ideas in the particles as is the growth of plant substance or animal bodies. The student of crystallography soon becomes convinced of the presence of life and consciousness in the world of crystals. In the contemplation of the plane of mineral consciousness, the student must remember that there are forms of minerals far more gross than those visible to us on this earth, and also that there are forms and phases of mineral life far finer and higher than those with which we are familiar here. The occult teachings contain some very interesting info concerning unknown mineral forms and manifestations. It may be mentioned here that the ancient alchemists and some of the true modern alchemists have found, in fact, of mineral consciousness their missing link of their science. The occultist, having a comprehensive understanding of the consciousness of a metal or mineral, will be able to work transformations upon it and through it, which would be impossible by means of chemistry or mechanical methods of treating metals. Here again is given a passing hint regarding a subject of tremendous importance, and I'm going to pause again here, folks. So the idea of this inherent consciousness in a metal or a mineral form is probably one of the key components to working an alchemical operation on such a thing. There is this inherent intelligence within it that reaches into this elemental plane or this subplane, the mineral plane. So far we've covered the elemental plane, the mineral plane, and now part 3 here, it says the plane of the plants. And we'll see how these successive steps into these different worlds or planes give you an indication of different levels of consciousness inherent within these things. And we'll see how it all relates and it all ties together and how they all overlap one with the other. And this is of a massive amount of importance, really, in the grand scheme of things. When you understand there are intelligent forces that guide and direct even these things that we would consider to be non-living, there's a life essence behind it that guides it all. And this is the important thing to understand. We have this intelligence, this consciousness that permeates all of this. And we have a very poor understanding of it. But these occultists within the Rosicrucian fraternity and some of the others claim to have a greater depth of knowledge on these things, and I think we can find some value in that, and that's why we cover these things. I think there are some core truths to what they do say, but of course a lot of things do get misrepresented through the course of time, and there's always a bit of poison laced in with all of it. But let's continue with our reading here. So next, part 3, the plane of the plants. On this plane of consciousness are manifested the actions and reactions of the protoplasmic cells of which the plants are composed. On this plane, as all the other planes of consciousness, there are to be found high and low subplanes and subdivisions of the latter. At the lower pole of this plane we find plant life, which is scarcely distinguishable from the higher forms of mineral life. In fact, as we have seen previously, it is almost impossible to draw a fixed line separating the two great plane divisions, for all planes blend into each other and are linked one with the other on the lower and higher poles of their activity. We have mentioned the diatoms, or living crystals, which the best authorities regard as the missing link between the two kingdoms, the two great kingdoms of life and consciousness, but which really are plants rather than minerals. The diatoms belong to an order of flowerless plants, a genus of the algols. They are covered by a siliceous covering, which gives them a crystalline appearance. They present the appearance of crystalline fragmentary particles, generally bound by right lines, flat, stiff, and brittle, usually nestling in slime, in which they unite into various forms and combinations, and from which they often again separate. They multiply and reproduce themselves by division and conjugation. I'm going to pause for a moment here, folks. So now we're talking about some of the various processes by which simple plants often will reproduce. And it looks very much like what happens in the formation of crystals. And there's this claim here that the Rosicrucians know about this missing link which connects these two different planes of consciousness, the mineral and the plant. And it has to do with what they call diatoms. Now, I don't know how much of this you can take verbatim and maybe apply in some sense. But it seems to me there's some important ideas here, the most important of which being the fact, or the claim, that consciousness permeates even minerals. That minerals themselves have a type of intelligence or consciousness guiding and directing their formation. And that we have these various kingdoms within these traditions. We have the mineral kingdom, the plant kingdom, the animal kingdom, and the human kingdom. And they all overlap and connect at various levels. And that's what they're talking about with these various planes. They interconnect all of these things. And like I said, I know it gets a little confusing and convoluted at times, but when you can understand some of the basics of what they teach in plain terms, like how they're talking here, then you could have a better overall view of what it is that these occult scientists believe they know that you don't. And maybe there's some core tenets of truth to it. And maybe we've been manipulated with those core tenets of truth. That being said, let's go ahead and continue reading here. In 1886, Professor Van Schramm of Naples, Italy, was experimenting with the bacilli of the Asiatic cholera and was examining the same under his high-powered microscope. He was attracted by the formation of double pyramids of bacilli in the shape and general appearance of true crystals. These living crystals manifested growth and movement and seemed to be alive and conscious. From these experiments, he arrived at the conclusions that all bacteria produce living crystals and has continued his experiments and seemed to verify his contention. These bacteria crystals are composed of homogeneous albuminous matter, which at first is colorless and structureless, and which at certain stage of their life history seem to lose their life qualities and to become, to all intents and purposes, dead crystals. These living crystals seem to be impelled by some inherent force akin to vital action to assume a geometrical figure, and while possessing these indications of elementary vegetable life, they also exhibit the characteristic qualities of crystals vis-a-vis refraction, inclusion, absorption, and polarization. Later investigations have revealed the presence of similar living crystals in the secretions of living organisms. Gonna pause for a moment here, folks. So now we're seeing comparisons in living cells to crystals by some of these scientists who were involved in these occult fraternities. And they made notes of these, and they compared them back to their secret doctrines that they knew, and were able to confirm some of these doctrines through the use of modern observation tools. At least this is the claim here being made in these types of workings here, these types of books that we're looking at. This book talking about the secret doctrine of the Rosicrucians. So if they have this core understanding and they've disguised it, then they have a better understanding of the growth of materials in this place, if this is true. Now, we do have to take some umbrage with some of this stuff, because since that time, there are other experiments that have been done that don't seem to align with what has been taught here, but that could be obfuscation. So we don't know, and that's the problem here, because much of the scientific research that they've done behind closed doors within the auspices of these occult fraternal brotherhoods has been kept hidden from the public purview. So perhaps the things that they're recording in these types of works have more merit to them than those that are established in the mainstream peer-reviewed scientific journals, and sometimes we see overlap in these things, and sometimes we don't. Sometimes we see that they're teaching within the occult fraternities the opposite of what's been put forth in mainstream science. Now, this becomes problematic, What do you believe? What do you really know? The only way we could really know is through experimentation and observation ourselves, with the use of the proper tools. So we're given these two different types of science. We have a mainstream accepted view of science, and then we have the occult science, otherwise known as metaphysics. And they're opposite sides of the same coin. And the function of reality occurs somewhere in the middle through the juxtaposition of the two of these. But see, like everything else, they've applied Hegelian dialectics to separate these things out. So either you look at it through only the lens of the occult or only the lens of what they would term modern science. So physics or metaphysics. And they don't want you to understand that there are core truths to both of these that need to be unified. You see, many of the observations are subjective, and many of them are objective, but you need both to come to an accurate understanding of the phenomena. You can't just apply one lens of observation to a thing and be satisfied that that gives you an overall view of how things really truly work. So ideas like scientific method, although it is a good method for observing and recording objective things, there are some subjective things that it lacks the ability to fully suss out. So you need other observational views. You need to come at things with these philosophical ways of thinking or these occult sciences as well. So you need the metaphysical lens as well as the physical lens to view these things. And that's much of what's missing in our modern viewpoints of science. But the Rosicrucians, they sought to bridge this gap with their secret doctrine here. So let's go ahead and we'll read on and see what else he can tell us here. That life is present in plant life scarcely anyone is disposed to question, though there seems to be a desire to deny consciousness and intelligent activity in the case of the part of the orthodox scientist. But the more advanced of the workers in the ranks of modern science do not hesitate to positively assert the presence of conscious intelligent activity in plant life and vigorously support their contention by logical argument backed up by incontrovertible facts gleaned in their laboratory experiments. These scientists hold that the presence of the phenomena of nutrition, reproduction, and of physical and chemical change due to adaptation is proof positive of the presence of vital intelligence within the organism in which the former are manifested. Professor Beiser says, quote, adaptation, after all, is the best evidence of the presence of intelligence or life in forms or units of matter. Adaptation, also called physiological adaptation, but best called psychological adaptation, is the one weapon by which living organisms fight against the destructive forces of conditions of nature. In all its forms, adaptation is the more or less successful cooperation of living organisms with the laws of nature. It is not the disregard of natural laws. In taking adaptation as our criterion by which the presence of intelligence is determined, we find no difficulty in settling the question of the presence of life. The most perfect automatic machinery has no life, because it cannot adapt itself in the least to the changing environmental conditions and thus save itself from annihilation, when necessity arises by the performance of simple intelligent acts. End quote. And I'm going to pause for a moment there. So that was a mouthful. But certainly, he's not wrong, is he? Adaptation. And you see where the perversion of the principle of adaptation came into play with Charles Darwin and that whole notion of quote-unquote evolution presented into the mainstream science. This is where the inversion principle was applied and where perversion of the idea took place and where it was steered into a material world paradigm way of thinking, wherein that's not the case at all. You see, they used this notion of Darwinian evolution to try to assert that there is no intelligence or consciousness behind the advent of life, or within the creation itself. It's a misapplication when adaptation proves the opposite. Do you see how they've taken the idea and turned it on its head and inverted it? Adaptation has been shown, and this denotes some type of natural intelligence working within the bounds of natural law and natural science to make these adaptations or changes so that life continues and thrives. It's an intelligent thing. Evolution, Darwinian evolution by definition, it lacks this intelligence or this life essence behind it, this notion of life behind it. But let's go ahead and we'll continue on. In their consideration of the question of the presence of consciousness in the kingdom of plant life, the writers divide the manifestations of intelligence into three classes, namely, trophoses, or acts of pertaining to nutrition, neuroses, or acts pertaining to the nervous system, and psychoses, or acts pertaining to thought processes. The manifestation of trophoses, or acts pertaining to nutrition, is apparent even in the case of the lowest forms of plant life. Even the lowliest vegetable cell takes nourishment and replaces the waste products of its system by fresh material taken into its system. These activities require a very simple nervous system, often practically no nervous system at all. But nevertheless, in every act of nutrition, there is manifested not only the presence of life, but also conscious activity of a certain degree. Even the lowest forms of plants are able to distinguish perfectly between nutritive and non-nutritive particles of matter. Most plants possess no nervous systems, at least none yet discovered by science, but nevertheless they manifest characteristic trophoses corresponding in degree with their necessities, but seldom exceeding those necessities. Other plants, however, have a comparatively highly developed nervous system or something corresponding to it, and manifest neuroses or acts pertaining to the nervous system of a comparatively high degree. This is true of the sensitive plants and certain other plants of a high development in this direction. Some of the orchids and a few other plants manifest neuroses, indicating clearly the presence of consciousness and a degree of intelligent activity. Going to pause for a moment here. So plants even display this notion of consciousness or intelligence inherent in them. This is undeniable to anybody who has ever observed or looked at any of these natural phenomena that occur with life. There is an intelligence, an inherent intelligence there, no matter how simple the organism is. And you could even make that argument for mineral compounds. There's an intelligence there. I think it's demonstrable, but yet our mainstream scientific paradigm denies that. There's this cult of denialism involved in it, because it's all about the inversion principle or process. They can't admit that there is a life force or essence behind everything. You see, we live in a culture that is based upon death-based ideas. That's what we've been handed. And this is the inversion principle at play. But if you really begin to study these things, you see it's undeniable. There has to be a guiding intelligence behind all of this, a guiding consciousness of sorts behind all of it. Let's go ahead and continue, though, because there's still a lot of ground to cover here. Still higher in the scale, we find certain species of plants manifesting true psychoses or acts pertaining to thought processes, although the latter are of a comparatively low order as compared to those manifested by the higher forms of animal life. With this class of manifestation, the average adult is not so well informed, and therefore it has been thought well to direct your attention in the following pages to these fascinating phenomena of plant life. We think that a careful consideration of the facts now about to be presented to the student will bring to him a clear realization of the presence of actual conscious activity in the kingdom of plants, and will cause him to accept the statement of that eminent authority, Professor Beiser, who has said, quote, "While we believe that the intelligence of man, animals, and plants is essentially the same in kind, we know that it differs enormously in degree and form. Even among men, this degree of intelligence varies, but this is because some individuals by nature see but a little more clearly their needs than others and live under more favorable circumstances. That is all." End quote. Dr. J.E. Taylor, an authority on the subject of plant psychology, says, quote, "Perhaps one reason why plants are usually denied consciousness and intelligence is because in the structure of even the highest developed species, we find no specialized nervous tract along with sensations may travel, or where they can be registered, as in the case of the ganglia and brains of the higher animals. But it should be remembered that none of the creatures subkingdom of the protozoa, the lowest of the grand divisions of the animal kingdom, possesses nervous structures, whilst many of the next more highly organized animal subkingdom, the coelenterata, have no trace, and the rest but a feeble development. Yet we do not deny those lowly organized animals a dim and diffused consciousness, or even the possibility of their structures being so modified that they can profit by experience, and thus develop that accumulated experience of their kind that we call instinct." End quote. So I'm going to pause for a moment here. So even in animals that don't seem to have a brain or nervous system, or even plants in that case, we see how they adapt. And adaptation requires some type of guiding intelligence or some form of consciousness. That is what is inherent in it. And you see, once again, how the inversion process has been adapted to this, applied to this. And of course, tongue-in-cheek, I say that, coining the phrase adapted, because it is kind of a paradox in and of itself, isn't it? And it is one of those things on which they have truly tricked humanity in our modern science into believing the opposite of what is true in this regard. You see, they've turned adaptation into Darwinian evolution and have taken the idea of an intelligence or consciousness guiding it completely out of the equation. There's no intelligent design, according to Darwinian evolution. Everything came about quite by accident. According to mainstream science, what is accepted, there's no intelligence in nature. How do you have natural laws but no intelligence that designed or guided those natural laws? It defies logic and reason, but of course this is what they tell us. All kind of developed by accident. Let's continue reading here, though. Darwin, speaking of the wonderful sensitiveness of the root tip of plants, says, quote, "It is hardly an exaggeration to say that the tip of the radicle, thus endowed and having the power of directing the movements of the adjoining parts, acts like the brain of one of the lower animals, the brain being seated within the arterior end of the body, receiving impressions from the sense organs, and directing the general movements." End quote. So going to pause there. So even Darwin, in his observations, notes intelligence within these processes. Intelligence inherent in plants. It has to be there. You see, that's the whole point. There has to be this underlying consciousness, this underlying force, if you will, this life force, life essence, guiding these processes. It is an intelligence. Professor Cope says, quote, "We can understand how by parasitism or other means of getting a livelihood without exertion, the adoption of new and skillful movements would become unnecessary, and consciousness itself would be seldom aroused. Continued repose would be followed by subconsciousness, and later by unconsciousness. Such appears to be the history of the entire vegetable kingdom." End quote. Dr. J.C. Arthur, in his interesting work entitled "The Sagacity and Morality of Plants," says, quote, "I have tried to show that all organisms, even to the very simplest, whether plant or animal, from the very nature of life and the struggle for its maintenance, must be endowed with conscious feeling, pleasure and pain being its simplest expression. I have been told in Java, as one walks through a tangle of sensitive plants, they will drop down in their deprecating way for yards on either side, as if suddenly aroused into life, only to be again transformed into lifeless sticks by some unseen power. The physical basis of life Protoplasm is the same for plants as for animals. The first differentiated or modified form of this we meet is the curious animalcule called amoeba. As we watch its movements, we cannot refrain from ascribing to it some dim consciousness of life it leads. But amoeboid structure is common even in the lowest kinds of plants, and amoeboid movements can be seen in some of its tissues. Witness also the habits and intelligent movements of the zoospores, of seaweed and many other algae, and the locomotion of the anthrozoa, of mosses, ferns, etc. Not many years ago, these objects were classed as animals, and nobody doubted these so-called animals behaved consciously and intelligently. Nothing can be more marked than the likes and dislikes of plants. Human beings can hardly express the same feelings more decidedly. There is perhaps even a messmateship among plants, which inclines species to prefer to grow in company. Hosts of common plants perform actions which, if they were done by human beings, would at once be brought into the category of right and wrong. There is hardly a virtue or a vice which has not its counterpart in the actions of the vegetable kingdom. As regards conduct in this respect, there is small difference between the lower animals and plants." End quote. And I'm going to pause for a moment there. So essentially what's being conveyed here is plants do seem to demonstrate a form of intelligence, and this has been recently put forward in the mainstream scientific literature, where they talk about trees can actually communicate with each other through their root systems and can lend nutrients one to the other. Plants seem to be a lot more intelligent than what we would consider. They demonstrate an intelligence that has been denied in mainstream science up until just recently. But you see, the Rosicrucians and the occult fraternities knew this long ago, because you have to acknowledge this life force, this consciousness, this intelligence that is inherent in nature. It most certainly is there if you observe it. But we see how these things have been misapplied and misconstrued in the modern era in our scientific ways of thinking, and they want you to believe otherwise. They want everything based in these death-based paradigm ideas, the inversion of how it really works. We have life and intelligence and consciousness all about us, but they seek to drive us into this unconscious type state of being, this death-like state, rather than life. It's the opposition to nature, it's the unnatural, it's the synthetic that they're trying to steer us into. And there are a myriad of reasons as to why we could argue this, but that's a discussion for another day. Let's get back to this, because there's still a lot of ground to cover. We're still only in the third plane here, the plant kingdom. One of the most elementary manifestations of consciousness and conscious action in plant life is what has been called the gravity sense, or the sense by which the plant recognizes the up and down direction of growth. The germinating seed always sends its root downward, no matter how the seed may be placed in the ground. This cannot be held to result merely from the action of gravitation, for the sprouts move upward and away from the center of gravity just as truly as the roots move downward and toward it. Experiments have proven that this sense of direction is as much a true sense as that of any of the special senses of the lowly animal life forms. The experiment has been tried of turning around a sprouting seed, the result being that in a day or so the roots will be again found to be turning downward and the sprouts turning upward. A French botanist named Duhamel once placed some beans in a cylinder filled with moist earth. After they had begun to sprout, he turned the cylinder a little to one side. The next day he turned it a little further in the same direction. Each day he would turn it a little more, until finally it had described several full circles. Then he took out the plant, and shaking off the clinging earth, he found that the beans, roots, and sprouts had described circles, two perfectly formed spirals being shown, one of the tiny roots and the other of the tiny sprouts. The roots, in their constant endeavor to move downward, had formed one perfect spiral, while the sprouts, in the constant effort to rise upward, had described another perfect spiral. No amount of effort will cause the roots of a plant to grow upward or its sprouts to grow downward. Each root and sprout has its own sense of direction to which it faithfully and invariably responds. In the same way, and from a similar cause, the tendrils of climbing plants will faithfully move towards the nearby support, and if they are untwined, they will return during the next night to the old support, if possible. Moving pictures, carefully prepared and taken over a long period, show that the movements of these tendrils to be akin to the movements of the limbs of an animal, the feelers and graspers of the octopus, for example. Not only have the roots of plants the general sense of direction, which causes them to grow downward in spite of all attempts to prevent them, but they have also the sense of moisture, which causes them to seek the direction of water. Many plants also turn their leaves and blossoms to the light, no matter how often they are turned in the opposite direction. Potatoes in dark cellars will often send forth their sprouts 20 or 30 feet in the direction of light, which shows through a tiny crack in the wall. Likewise, plants possess the sense of taste to a very high degree in some cases. By means of this sense, they are able to detect differences in substances and to choose those substances which are conducive to their nutrition. They are able to distinguish between poor and rich soil, and also between different chemicals of differing nutritive values. They always move their roots in the direction of the best food supply and also toward moisture. Not only do the roots of plants move in the direction of water, but instances have been cited in which leaves of plants will bend over during the night and dip themselves in a vessel of water several inches away. Insect-eating plants recognize the difference between living animal substance and bits of inorganic matter or vegetable substance, casting off the latter two as if in disgust. Experiments have been made of placing a bit of cheese in the reach of such plants, when, though cheese is of course unfamiliar to them, they will seem to recognize its nitrogenous nature and will devour it as readily as they will a piece of flesh or the body of an insect. Going to pause for a moment here. So that's an interesting observation here too. Did you know that insect-eating plants will eat cheese? Just goes to show the goodness of cheese. But that's a subject for another time as well. Let's get back to this. There's a lot of ground still to cover. Many students are doubtless familiar with the instance of the sensitive plants which exhibit a marked degree of sensibility to touch. Many insect-eating plants manifest an equally high degree of sensitiveness, though of course in a different direction. The leaves of the Venus flytrap fold open each other and thus capture the unfortunate insect which has been tempted into the trap by the sweet juice which appears upon the leaf as a dainty bait. The folding of the leaves follows the alarm given by the 3 sensitive bristles or hairs, which act as feelers, which sense the presence of the insects. Bits of earth or raindrops are recognized as not food by these feelers, and no closing of the leaves results from their presence on the leaves. Other plants are very sensitive to degrees of light, and they close at certain hours, the time varying according to the species of plant. It was formerly held that this sensitiveness to light was merely a chemical response to the presence of light, but recent experiments have shown that such plants, when placed in a dark room, will continue this closing for several days in a gradually lessening degree, thus indicating the presence of a habit within their consciousness, which habit indicates the presence of mind even more forcibly than does the closing itself. Certain ferns will wither if their fronds are touched too often. So I'm going to pause for a moment here. So the author goes on at length to describe more of these aspects of plants, which describe that it does indeed have a type of intelligence behind it. There is a consciousness behind it. There is a guidance to it, but we're going to go ahead and skip ahead a little for time's sake here. To number 4, the plane of animals. The plane of animals. We get the idea. Plants seem to have this inherent intelligence, and only now, here in the year 2024, are they beginning to explore this notion that plants have a type of consciousness. And this was known by the Rosicrucians for a very, very long time. But let's continue on. Number 4, the plane of the animals. Here, once more, we discover that there is no fixed dividing line between the adjoining planes of consciousness. Just as the mineral consciousness is closely blended into the plant consciousness, as we have seen, so is the plant consciousness closely blended into the animal consciousness. In fact, in the lowly forms of animal life, it is almost impossible at times to state positively whether the particular form under consideration is a plant or an animal. Forms which science formerly considered animal are not placed in the category of plant life, and other forms which science once held to belong to the plant kingdom are now placed in the category of animal life. The occultist recognized that these disputed forms dwell in the region in which the two respective planes blend and intermingle, as has been stated before in these pages. Consciousness in animal life varies from the first faint glimmerings in this single-celled creatures in the slime of the ocean bed to the full dawn in the highest forms of animals, like the horse, the dog, the elephant, etc. In each and every case, however, it will be found that each creature is endowed with a sufficient degree of intelligence to meet its needs and requirements, to adapt to its environment. As the environment increases in complexity, the form of animal life has either adapted its consciousness to meet the requirements or else has perished in the course of evolution. Going to pause for a moment here. So the occultists are the ones who originally came up with this idea of evolution, and we've discussed this ad nauseum in the past. But the version of evolution presented in the original teachings of the various secret schools is the opposite, or is much different from what is taught as evolution today. Largely today, what's been adopted as evolution is this notion of Darwinian evolution as a purely physical concept, a material world physical concept, in which they've embedded these ideas based on death-based principles. The inversion of what it truly is in the natural realm. It's based on life and consciousness and intelligence. Well, they've taken all the intelligence out of it and made it into a lifeless force. And this is what they claim guides things, and this is what they claim has come about by accident. Through some grand cosmic accident, we have this natural law that they now call evolution, and they've imbued it with these different oppositional ideas to what the original intent behind it has been. Now, I do take umbrage with some of the teachings in regards to many of these things, because even though they acknowledge within the secret schools the presence of this consciousness and this life force, they often will deny the Creator himself. You see, they often will deify nature or the creation as the Creator, and that is a gross misconception that has been put forward in these secret schools, which further leads down the path and trail towards the inversion process, or the taking of these ideas based in the concept of life and consciousness and devolving them into this idea that there is no God, that man himself can be God. Everything came about by accident and is all the expression or side effect of some material physical world cause and effect sequence. That's what's been done here, and that's what's been applied to human understanding in the modern era, and it is a gross misconception of what the original teachings were about. Now, it's sad that it's come to that, and I don't think all of these people that have been involved in Rosicrucianism or some of the secret societies have necessarily had ill intent. But those who have acquired power in this world, let's put it this way, they've turned to the dark side and have applied these things in a way that's not beneficial to the whole of humanity. They've applied their ideals, they've applied this knowledge in ways that brings about this inversion principle. And if you want a true definition of what Satanism is, it is the inversion principle. Plain and simple. And this is what's been applied. So they acknowledge they've known many of these things from time immemorial. They understand that we have this consciousness, this intelligence, this life, ever present, permeating everything in this reality. And this ultimately infers the existence of a creator. And yet, what's been done is the denialism thereof by those who have taken this knowledge, hidden it away from the masses, and inverted it and applied it in the opposite direction so that they themselves can have power and be like unto the Creator. They can be like as gods. It's the original lie in the Garden of Eden, folks, the great lie. You can be as gods. That's what they've done with this knowledge. And it wasn't originally intended for that purpose. But let's get back to the reading here, and let's see what we can find out about this animal kingdom, this animal plane. Both science and the occult teachings inform us that animal life had its origin in the slime of the primeval ocean beds and took the form of the single-cell creatures. The best-known form of single-cell animal is the moneron, or the plural of monera, which is composed of but a single cell and is like a tiny drop of glue. It belongs to the lowest class of animal life, known as the protozoa. The moneron lives in water and is a very minute, shapeless, colorless, slimy, sticky drop of protoplasmic substance. It has no organs of any kind, and all of its parts are similar. It lacks the separate organs or parts with which to perform the offices of the living creature as found in the higher forms of life, and yet this organless creature performs the processes of life like known, respectively, as nutrition, reproduction, sensation, and will action. Every part of the moneron is capable of absorbing food and oxygen. It is all stomach and all lungs. Moreover, it is all reproductive organism. It envelops its prey by enclosing the latter as a drop of glue encloses a tiny gnat, and it then absorbs the nourishment from its food through every portion of its surface coming in contact with the food. It moves by prolonging a portion of itself outward, like a tiny tail or finger. This constitutes the false foot by which it propels, pushes, or pulls itself forward or backward, or sidewise. When it gets ready, it pulls back the false foot into the general substance, and is the same as before. It has no distinction of sex, but reproduces itself by simply growing larger and then dividing itself into two. And the process is over, there being two monera where only one moneron was the moment before. And yet this simple creature receives impressions from outside and responds thereto. It seeks its food and escapes its enemies. It has all the mind it needs. Next, in the rising scale of animal life, we find the amoeba. This creature is also a one-celled animal. It progresses by a continuous projection of false feet and a subsequent drawing in of the same, which gives it the appearance of a many-fingered or many-footed thing. This creature has the beginning of parts and organs. In the first place, it has a nucleus at its center, and also an expanding and contracting cavity within itself, which it uses for holding, digesting, and distributing its food, a rudimentary stomach, so to speak. It also has something like a skin on its surface, and it cannot be turned inside out like its brother the moneron without disturbing its life. Let us pause here for a moment before passing on to the consideration of the higher forms of animal life. The purpose of the pause is to call your attention to the resemblance of the monera and amoeba to the cells of which the human body is composed. The ordinary cells of the higher animal and mankind closely resemble the monera in many ways, while the white corpuscles of the blood of animals and men bear a striking resemblance to the amoeba, so far as is concerned their size, general structure, and movements. In fact, science classes them as amoeboids, the white corpuscles of our blood. These amoeboids change their shape, take food in an intelligent manner, and live an apparently independent life with movements showing undoubted thought and will. So I'm going to pause there for a moment, folks. So even in the presence of cellular function within higher animals, we see this inherent intelligence. And certainly, I think this is demonstrable and it's undeniable. We're going to skip through a little bit here. because it talks more at length about cell processes. I want to get to the crux of what's important here, rather than going into obscure details about specific forms of animal life that he talks about here, and get to the meat of the matter. I want to cover all 7 of these planes of existence that they talk about in Rosicrucian teaching. So we have this of the animals, and you get the idea. We see in the lower forms of animal life this crossover between what could be considered plant-like ways of behaving and animal-like ones. So, speaking of higher animal life, we can see here in the ascending scale of animal life, the student will perceive countless varieties in species, subspecies, and variations among species, and in each there will be perceived some slight difference in the degree and quality of the intelligence manifested by the creature. Even among the individuals of the same species there is found a great variation in such manifestations, but throughout it all, there is perceived to be a certain general plane of consciousness which may be called the animal plane, as distinguished from the mineral plane on the one hand, and the human plane on the other hand. So next we're going to get into the plane of the human. And this is where we're going to find some important distinctions, I suspect. But the whole point behind this is we see that this notion of consciousness or intelligence undergirds and supersedes everything else. It permeates through all of these various planes of observation and existence. So let's go ahead and read about the plane of the human. Passing from the plane of animal consciousness to that of the plane of human consciousness, we soon become cognizant of the presence of a new element of consciousness. This element is known as self-consciousness, or the consciousness which enables man to say knowingly of himself, I am I. To identify himself as the thinker apart from the thoughts, the actor apart from the action, the feeler apart from the feelings, the willer apart from the voluntary activities, the conscious subject apart from the phenomena of the senses. It is true that in the primitive forms of human life, this new consciousness exists but as a faint dawn, but it is latent there, and the ascent of man progresses this new conscious flames out in higher and higher forms. What this new element of self-consciousness is, we shall see presently. In thinking of man, we must remember that primitive human beings, little removed from the apes, are as much man as is the highest individual of the race today, or as will be his still higher descendant of tomorrow. And we must not forget that the plane of human consciousness is closely linked to, and blended with, the plane of animal consciousness at one of its sides. The best scientific and the best occult teaching hold that man and the ape descended from some common ancestral form in the long ages past. The common ancestor was the trunk from which the man branch sprung on one side and the ape branch sprung on the other. And I'm going to pause for a moment here. And now you could begin to see where a bit of the poison started to mix in with the Rosicrucian ideology, because this is the foundation where Darwinian evolution comes from. You can see they're making this claim here. They've accepted that notion as being a truth, when most certainly it goes counter to what the original teaching and intent was. You see, this is where the death-based ideologies come in. This is where the inversion principle begins to be applied, and we see that being presented to you right here. Let's continue. It must not be forgotten that the lowest races of man known to us today are as far removed in degree of intelligence from the highest known types of mankind as from the highest apes or man-apes. In fact, many think that evolution from the highest apes to the Kafir, Hottentot, or Digger Indian is no more difficult than would be the evolution of those lowly types of human life up to the types of Emerson, Shakespeare, Huxley, Darwin, Edison, and other high types of cultured man. Huxley has shown us that the brain structure of man as compared with chimpanzees, shows differences but slight as compared to the differences between that of the chimpanzee and that of the lemur. He also shows us that in the important feature of the deeper brain furrows and intricate convolutions, the chasm between the highest civilized man and the lowest savage is far greater than between the lowest savage and the highest man-ape. Darwin, in his description of the very low type of human beings found among the Fuegian savages, says, quote, "Their very signs and expressions are less intelligible to us than those of the domesticated animal. They are men who do not possess the instinct of those animals, nor yet appear to boast of human reason, or the least of the arts consequent upon that reason." End quote. And I'm going to pause for a moment here to point out the obvious. This is wherein this inversion principle became applied to what is the good meat of what they're teaching. And they've taken and twisted and contorted and perverted these ideas to such a degree that they show here, in no undistinct terms, what they truly think now. They think there's this great chasm in human consciousness, in human beings, that there are certain races that are inferior to others, as demonstrated here, and this is the root and cause of all racism in this world. It's been promulgated by these secret society groups, these occult fraternities, based upon this teaching that they have in their secret doctrine, talking about what they call root races of man. And you see how they've taken the scientific types of discoveries and ideas that were promulgated in the mid to late 1800s, and they've applied them in the direction of inversion in these teachings of the essence of consciousness or life inherent in everything, and they've turned it into a death-based ideology, and they've created division and divisive ways of thinking between modern man, between different portions of modern man. You see, they've began to equate these notions that they attach to Darwinian evolution to the whole idea that undergirded the premise of eugenics. And that is that there are some races that are superior to others of mankind, and there are other races of mankind that are inferior, and they need to use their will and their knowledge to guide the evolutionary process of man. You see, eugenics is just the older notion for transhumanism, self-guided evolution. That's what it's always been about. They seem to want to dwindle out the portions of humanity that they see as inferior and only elevate those they see as superior, those traits within man. And like I said, this is where you see where the perversion of the teachings comes in and has been applied, and the inversion principle has been put in place, and we have division and dissent, and we have those within the highest, most echelons of many of these secret schools that think that they belong to some superior form of mankind, some superior sub-race or root race than others, and they want to try to engineer those inferior qualities out of mankind through self-guided evolution into the future here. You see how it's become very twisted very quick with their belief systems? But let's read on here. Professor Claude, in his description of the primitive man, says, quote, "Doubtless he was lower than the lowest of the savages of today, a powerful, cunning biped with keen sense organs, always a sharper by virtue of constant exercise in the savage than in the civilized man who supplements them by science, strong instincts, uncontrolled and fitful emotions, small faculty of wonder and nascent reasoning power, unable to forecast tomorrow or to comprehend yesterday, living from hand to mouth on the wild products of nature, clothed in skin and bark, or daubed with clay, and finding shelter in trees and caves, ignorant of the simplest arts, save to chip a stone missile and perhaps to produce fire, strong in his needs of life and vague sense of right to it, and to what he could get, but slowly impelled by common perils and passions to form ties, loose and haphazard at the outset, with his kind, the power of combination with them depending on sounds, signs, and gestures." End quote. So we see the conception here that they're saying primitive man didn't have much reasoning capacity. You see, he was little different than the savages of today, and that's how they describe some of these other sub-races, which they would consider lesser from their point of view. They describe them as savages in many of these teachings. But let's get to what they claim is the important bit of it here. You see how the distinction's been made and how this infers that perhaps there are some human beings alive today that they consider lesser beings because they claim they don't have as highly evolved a consciousness as many of them. And this is the portion we'll get into. So it continues here. It says, "Consciousness, known as the self-consciousness of man, will be pursued further in the succeeding chapter, in which chapter will also be taken up the consideration of the two still higher planes of consciousness, known as the plane of demigods and the plane of gods, respectively." And I'm going to pause right there. So those are the last two of these 7 planes that they claim. The plane of gods and the plane of demigods. Higher planes of consciousness. And you see, they view themselves as demigods within these occult fraternities and secret schools. And they want to be gods. And this is what they strive for. And you could also see where they claim that there's overlap between these various planes of existence. So it's not unfeasible in their perspective that they, the demigods, can live among man here in his limited amount of consciousness that he has in this regard. Do you see how the hubris sets in? Do you see how the inversion principle sets in and how the great lie sets in with this? Now, we're going to continue a little bit here into what they call the 3 higher planes of consciousness here, which close up with the plane of the demigods and the plane of the gods. And we're going to explore a little bit of that before we sign off. But you get the idea, don't you? You see where they're going with this. The 3 higher planes of consciousness. We have now reached the stage of our presentation of the subject of the secret doctrine of the Rosicrucians, and particularly of that known as the 7 planes of consciousness, in which we ask the student to consider those phases of consciousness above the plane of animal consciousness. Accordingly, our present consideration is with those 3 great planes of consciousness, which begin with the plane of human consciousness and include the planes of the consciousness of the demigods, and which find their highest manifestation on the plane of the consciousness of the gods. While these 3 higher planes of consciousness are included in the Rosicrucian symbol of the 7 planes of consciousness, i.e. the 7 linked circles, the Rosicrucians have also a special symbol by which they seek to indicate these 3 wonderful higher planes of consciousness vis-a-vis the symbol of the 3 linked circles. It will be noticed here, also, that each of the circles are linked with the 2 on either side of it, the circumference of each circle extending over that of the 2 others on either side of it. This indicates that each plane of consciousness is blended with the others, a truth which will be made more apparent as we progress without commentary on the teaching of this chapter. So we have the plane of human consciousness. As the name indicates, it's the plane of conscious activity which is manifested by human beings, high and low, in varying degrees. This plane of consciousness, like all the other of the 7 planes of consciousness, is divided into 7 subplanes, and each of these into 7, and so on, as explained in preceding chapters of this book. Moreover, at one pole, this plane is linked with and blends into the highest subplanes of the plane of animal consciousness, while at the other pole it blends into the lower subplanes of the next highest plane, i.e. the plane of the consciousness of the demigods. Again, following the symbol of the three linked circles, the same individual who manifests on the plane of human consciousness is, in a measure, in touch with the two higher planes known respectively as the plane of consciousness of the demigods and the plane of consciousness of the gods. The reason that the Rosicrucians place these three higher planes of consciousness in a trinity of circles, apparently apart from the lower four planes, is that on these three higher planes of consciousness, the individual soul manifests self-consciousness, or the consciousness of I am, in at least a certain degree. Well, on the lower four planes, this consciousness of I is entirely absent, and the mental activity is more or less automatic and instinctive. This distinction will be brought out as we proceed. Going to pause for a moment here, folks. So the claim is that on the lower planes of consciousness, there is no individuation. There is no individuality. And I find that as being problematic because I have had experience with animals, pets, and such in the past that had their own unique personalities that didn't seem to be necessarily guided or directed by some outside group spirit, as they claim in the Rosicrucian teachings. And maybe there's something more there. Or maybe there's not, or maybe this is an illusion, as claimed by the Rosicrucians. Or maybe there is an evolutionary process going on wherein all of these vibratory frequencies are beginning to rise, not only in the human being, but in animal life too, wherein maybe they are at the beginning phases of expressing individuation. I've come across all these different ways of thinking in this occult research. I don't know what the truth of the matter is, but I do take umbrage with the notion that animals don't necessarily have an individual personality or individuation of sorts. I think they most certainly do. You can see that, and they do have traits in common with others, and they are guided by instinct to a certain degree. But to say that they differ in this individuation process, that's putting a very broad category on things by way of the Rosicrucians here. And although I think there are some inherent values in the ideas they put forward, I think there's flaws with them as well. But of course they can't admit that, because then to admit that, well, it kind of throws a lot of the credence of what they say out the window. And I don't know if that's necessarily a good thing or not. Like I've said in the past, you can find value in all of these things. I think it's important to go through this stuff and consider these ideas. Certainly, they deserve consideration. And I think there are some inherent core truths behind some of it. But the process of learning about it has become so contorted through the course of time from within these secret schools that it's hard to find the value, because they always have the poison mixed with the value. So it requires a great deal of discernment to suss through a lot of this and sort it out. But anyway, let's get back to what they're saying here. On the very lowest forms of human consciousness, the man's mental and emotional activity is but little more than that of the higher animals. In fact, in some cases, the animals actually seem to display a greater degree of intellectual power, though on instinctive lines. But even in the lowest form of human life, there appears at least a faint glimmering of self-consciousness, or the conviction that I am I. The form of consciousness by means of which the human individual becomes aware of himself as an individual entity. This, rather than the degree of intellectual development, is the characteristic distinguishing mark of the human being. It is quite difficult to describe clearly in words the actual distinction between the highest forms of animal consciousness and the lowest forms of self-consciousness of the human being, although the difference between the highest animal and the highest man in this respect is quite marked. Admittedly, the difficulty of the explanation, it may be said that while even in the case of the highest animal, the consciousness is always directed outward, in even the lowest type of man, there is at least a faint degree of the inward direction of consciousness. The animal always thinks of outside things, while even the primitive man occasionally thinks of himself, makes himself the object of his own thoughts, in at least the sense of considering his feelings, ideas, etc., and comparing them with others previously had by him. Or again, there is no inside world or something within to the animal, while man always, at least in some degree, is aware of the inside world or the something within as distinguished from the something without. And I'm going to pause for a moment here, folks. Now, this, in and of itself, presents a vast myriad of different ideas that can be construed from this past paragraph that we read. You see, it has been found in some more recent scientific studies and observations, and I don't know if you've seen this, but I find this to be a truly fascinating thing. They did studies wherein people don't have what they call an internal dialogue. Have you heard this? What they mean by internal dialogue is these people don't think in terms of words inwardly in their thought processes. They don't think in terms of language. They think only maybe in images or symbolically, if at all. And this has been described in many ways, and I find this to be problematic. Are there really people that lack internal dialogue? Think about that. Well, what does that indicate? I think we all have some form of internal dialogue wherein we're thinking to ourselves and we have these thoughts and our mind goes all day long talking to itself. Think about that. We have this internal dialogue all the time. But there has been claimed in modern scientific studies now that there are some people that lack that. And this gives rise to the notion of what has become termed the NPC in modern memes, in modern ways of thinking here. On the conspiratorial side of things, they talk about this notion that perhaps there's NPCs, non-player characters, or that we have some type of manifestation here of a different type of consciousness that's kind of pre-programmed and not really all there, not fully human. That's what this infers, and this ties along these lines of thinking as well within this Rosicrucian system. That perhaps these are the lower forms of human beings they're talking about in this regard. And you see how all of this has arisen in popularity in this conspiratorial subculture in recent years. You even have the notion of what's called organic portals has been brought forward as a portion of this NPC phenomenon that we do see in the modern circles of occultism and in modern conspiratorial thought. So people refer to others in a derogatory way as NPCs, ones that are just order takers and just go along to get along and do those things which are expected by society at large. So it's kind of a derogatory term. It kind of gives credence to this notion, and it kind of goes along with this idea that there are lesser races or races that are not as evolved as others, or there's people at least that are not as evolved as others. And it's a dehumanization process. It dehumanizes people. And they're trying to give scientific credence to this idea now, and we see this out there, and I think it's a dangerous ideology. I really, truly do. Because it claims there are some that are somehow superior to others or more conscious than others. And this relates to this self-conscious idea presented here in the Rosicrucian philosophy. So they claim the animal can't know himself, but the human being, that this is something distinct to the human being, that we have this individuation, we have this inherent I am within the ontological self, knowledge of ontological self, awareness, self-awareness, self-consciousness. And then when you apply this way of thinking to, say, artificial intelligence, well, this gives you more of a notion towards this thought process of the NPC phenomenon, doesn't it? And when you have people that readily accept that we live in a simulation, this becomes even more of a dangerous ideology, doesn't it? Because this devalues life. Do you see the dangers inherent in this? And you see how it ties back to these ways of thinking? And of course, I don't think we're going to touch too much on the plane of the consciousness of the demigods or the gods here, because this is wherein the crossover happens now, where you have these people, these dark occultists who run things in this world, who seem to think themselves superior in some regard, in that they are these demigods and can become gods themselves, and want to have total control over the rest of these inferior humans below them. And they attempt to do this through the utilization of these ideas. Let's read a little on the plane of consciousness of the demigods here before we sign off. There is a plane of consciousness so much higher than even the plane of human consciousness, of even the highest subplanes of that great plane, that the Rosicrucians have applied to it the somewhat fanciful term, the plane of the consciousness of the demigods. This because the individual who attains these heights and is able to conscious on this plane is so much higher than mere man that he seems to be almost as the gods. The Rosicrucians teach that on this high plane of being dwell certain very advanced souls, once men, but now almost as gods, who, compared to men, who aid in the great work of the advancement of the race of men in the general course of spiritual evolution. And I'm going to pause for a moment, and we've heard this from the Theosophists and from the various other ones too. These are the ascended masters. This is the Great White Lodge in Theosophy. Those human beings who have advanced to this stage of evolution of their consciousness. This is what they claim, and do you see the hubris of this idea? Do you understand what it is they teach? And of course, illumination is one of the key factors to this, as they call it. Illumination, apotheosis, becoming godlike. Well, this is when your consciousness transcends that of a mere mortal man, and you become one of these ascended masters, and you are on this new plane of consciousness. You see, you function differently. You don't have to abide by the same creeds and rules of man, because you've evolved past that, and therefore whatever you do is okay according to your will. That is the new law, and it supersedes natural law. This is how they teach. This is what is inferred in these teachings. And briefly, let's touch upon what they call the plane of the consciousness of the gods. If, as we have seen, it is most difficult to speak in understandable terms concerning the phases of life and activity on the last plane of consciousness, what must be the difficulty of even hinting at the life and activities of the highest plane of all, the plane of the consciousness of the gods? On this highest of all planes of consciousness, however, dwell beings so high in the scale of knowledge, power, life, and bliss that even the imagination of the advanced student or teacher can scarcely grasp the idea. This is the plane of the gods, in verity, of being so far advanced that they are practically akin to the conception of the gods, created by man to account for the universe and to serve as objects of worship. And I'm going to pause for a moment. Did you catch that? The conception of the gods created by man to account for the universe. So once again, this is wherein the poison gets mixed. This is wherein they lead you astray from truth, from acknowledgement of God, of the Creator. You see, it's just the universe. It's just the universe. It's just the creation. The creation is God. The creation is the Creator. This is a false paradigm. They teach the universe is ever extant, and that there are many small g gods. But there is no capital G God, no creator. The creation is the Creator in their estimation, in their viewpoint. And this is where they mix the poison in. And this is where their hubris becomes apparent. And this is wherein they separate themselves from the natural laws that have been created by the Creator in this place. This is wherein they invert those principles, and they see themselves as being above the law. They don't have to be bound by this once they reach this certain level of illumination. At least in their view, they think they're themselves above natural laws. They think of themselves above moral principles. They don't have to abide by that. Only their will is what matters at that point. This is what's been inferred and what's been taught and what's been perverted into these secret doctrines and secret teachings. So this is what they give you, and this is how it's been convoluted. And you could see, through the course of time, how many of these older ideas that may have had good intentionality behind them and truth behind them have been inverted into this system of synthetic initiation, this system of bringing into existence a synthetic reality, which is based in the death-based ideals rather than life-based ideals, that denies the truth of these very principles that express to us in no uncertain terms that there is life or consciousness, intelligence that guides and directs things. They've taught us to believe otherwise. Yet, at the topmost levels, these dark occultists who run things very much acknowledge that these things do manifest in certain ways, and they are inherent and undeniable. But you see, they seek control over that, so they have to create a synthetic form of that, an artificial form of that they can be the gods or controllers of, and that's why they've applied these principles in opposition in that way. And that's where we're at today. So speaking on Rosicrucianism's 7 planes of existence, we've seen them here, we've outlined them, we tell you what it is they believe, and they're not talking about what you think they're talking about, as is the case in most of the time, but you can also see how they've taken these ideas and they've applied them into the scientific, materialistic paradigm of today and weaponized them against the bulk of humanity at large, because they've contorted and inverted these principles. And they've foisted upon us Darwinian evolution, and they've used this to prop up the whole house of cards. That's why it's such a vested interest in modern science. That's why they have accepted it and pushed it as fact, when in fact there are so many fallacies in the idea that it doesn't stand up to scrutiny. But they continue to do everything in their power to validate that, because it's the basis upon which they've built this house of cards for the purposes of creating a system of control, a system of inversion, of completely inverting the natural order to obtain control over that and become godlike. That's what's happened. These dark occultists who run things at the top of the power structure have taken some of these old ideas, hidden them away in secret chambers, in secret teachings, kept them hidden from the masses, and were able to, over the course of time, slowly change what these secret teachings talk about and invert them from their original good intention to this ill intention. And they've done it slowly over the course of time. They've manipulated it to suit their own agendas, and then they teach it forward as if it's truth, when you can find these points in the historical background of these occult fraternities wherein the original teachings have been turned on their head by a select few individuals. And then we have what we have today. And they utilize these principles as a form of control over others, and here we sit, talking about it. And of course, this is just one of many of the facets of the secret teachings, the secret doctrine that they acknowledge and they think they've mastered, that they've contorted through the course of time, weaponized against us. So Rosicrucianism, 7 planes of existence. You see how they've taken some good foundational ideas and turned them on their heads as a control system. The application of cybernetics methodologies therein to misdirect human consciousness, to misdirect the human mind, the human spirit, the human soul, in many regards, all for the purposes of power in the hands of a select few. That's what it's always been about. But anyway, folks, I want to thank you all for tuning in. That's all the time we have for tonight. I want to remind you I appreciate each and every one of you. We'll catch you next time. Have a good one now. Discover the amazing, clinically proven health benefits of original Tahitian noni. Original Tahitian noni includes powerful antioxidants, adaptogens, nutrients, and phytonutrients to naturally boost energy levels, immune system function, and overall health. Meticulously sourced from French Polynesia, this is the original superfruit, except no imitations. Original Tahitian noni. Visit ATR Health at alchemicaltechrevolution.com. and click on the Shop Here tab for more details.
But we can no longer risk emergency improvisation of national defense. We have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry of vast proportions. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.